So for the past 10 or so years, people know to dread phone calls or emails from me because, aside from being a freelancer looking for work, or sometimes an editor looking for them to do some work they don't want to do, I'm trying to convince them to do something, to commemorate Will and his work and graphic novels and free speech and just the whole wonderful world of sequential art, which, all kidding aside, people are glad to do because everybody loved Will.
Welcome back, everyone. Today we are at Wildwood Cemetery with Danny Fingeroth. We are talking about the legacy of Will Eisner. How are you?
Hello, glad to be back. And I'm in Wildwood. I'm in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum from the movies, but Steve Ditko, who designed Doctor Strange's world, based it on the window in Denny Colt's tomb in Wildwood Cemetery in the Spirit. So it's appropriate, Plus, my hair looks terrific in this background.
Can you tell us about how you got involved working with Will Eisner and the whole legacy?
It goes back to my childhood again, and when I was 12, Jules Feiffer's The Great Comic Book Heroes came out. Some of you have probably seen the book. Maybe you've either read the edition that, a version of the original edition that I don't have right here. But I will have it in my slideshow later.
I've read the original.
That's the way to read it, because there's a later version that has the text that R. Sikoriak did a great cover for, but I don't think they could get the rights to use the excerpts from the comics again. So it's well worth reading. But with the original version, it's bigger, it's coffee table size, and it's got the original Superman. And when I was 12 years old, you couldn't, obviously not the internet, but not even in bookstores or libraries could you get reprints of comics from the 30s and 40s. So, and we got partly what we expected. The first appearance of Superman in Action Comics, first appearance of Batman, Hawkman, Captain America,
Captain Marvel,
and then this character called the Spirit that nobody had ever heard of. Nobody, not among my group of comic-loving friends, nobody had ever heard of the Spirit. Nobody ever heard of Will Eisner, because Eisner had sort of taken himself out of the game. He had, I don't know if it's coincidence or not, but in 1952 he got married and he stopped doing the Spirit. So he went into doing a more commercial, instructional and corporate and humor comics and instruction manuals for the military. So the Spirit had not been in print for over a decade. So if you're talking about 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kids, it's a lifetime. Yeah. Suddenly here's this Spirit, the story of the Spirit in the Great Comic Book Heroes. And Feiffer, part of his, one of his motives for writing the book was to reintroduce the world to Will Eisner, because Feiffer had started his career as an assistant in Eisner's office. He came in there as a teenager and bullshitted his way into a job. I mean, if you've seen or heard or read Jules Feiffer, he's brilliant.
Yes. And
he was the ultimate comics fan at that age, and he knew more about Eisner's career than Eisner did. He was more of an Eisner expert than Eisner was, and talked himself into a job and ended up doing a lot of writing and artwork, which when we go through the slides, we'll talk more. So suddenly I'm introduced to the Spirit. The Spirit's in my world. It was one of the pre-war Spirits, which was it's very film noir, very Wellesian, not quite, didn't have the humor elements that some of the later Spirit stories had. And I'll show you some images from that story, and it blew everybody's mind. And that was, then right after that came the Batman, the Adam West Batman TV show. Comics were, and Marvel was becoming popular, and so comics were becoming the subject mainstream magazines and books and parental concerns. So so Harvey Comics put out a couple of giant-size Spirit reprints. Again, blew our minds. That thing I remember, the story I remember most from then is the story. I think it's called The Barber, but it's about. It opens up with a multi-panel page, which I don't have in the slideshow. I should make that part of it. A guy is getting a haircut, and he's sort of just having like a typical kind of barbershop conversation with the barber. But then it turns out he's getting his hair cut. He's getting his head shaved to get to be electrocuted in the electric chair.
Yeah, I remember this one.
And then I think the barber was like the husband of the woman the guy murdered. And I mean, holy cow, maybe you'd see stuff like that on television and shows like The Untouchables, which were very gritty and intense and noirish. But this was the first time, you'd really seen it in comics. And then, so two big reprints like that. And then Eisner was being written about. He did a news story for, I think, for the Herald Tribune of the Spirit somehow being involved with the New York mayoral election of 1965 or 66. And suddenly the Spirit was just on people's minds. I think really because Feiffer had reminded everybody about it. Because Eisner, I think, was reasonably content. He was making a good living doing these kind of more educational and corporate and military comics. But I think he was itching to do something else. And Feiffer, I think, just felt, well, this guy just shouldn't be wasting his time doing this stuff. Sure, he's making nice money, but he's Will friggin' Eisner. So that was when my first introduction to Eisner. And then as years went on and the underground comics came out and became popular, Eisner got to know some of those people, Dennis Kitchen and Art Spiegelman and Crumb. I think he got to know Crumb. And James Warren, first Kitchen, then Warren, who was famous for his horror comics and other black and white comics. They put out reprints of the Spirit stories, and they were very, I ate those up like candy. I mean, those were just, and then it was shortly after that Contract with God came out, not really shortly, but within that 10-year period, Contract with God came out. So that was an interesting departure, to say the least, for Eisner, because everybody knew him from the Spirit. And suddenly here's this whole other thing that's kind of like a Saul Bellow novel or a Philip Roth novel in comics form, which Eisner, how old is he then? He was maybe 60, which seemed very old when you're 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, and yet here he was reinventing himself, as he would continue to do for years. So I guess it really started when I was 12 with great comic book heroes. And so cut to years later, I had my whole career at Marvel and started to write books so I was doing, and I'd met Will a couple of times at the San Diego Con, which is ridiculous. He lived in New York, but I never thought to, maybe by then he was in Florida. This is a whole other thing. I was not one of those people who was bold enough to just go knock on my favorite artists' doors, even though they just lived in, suburban homes that anybody could ride their bike up to. So Will was just always part of my consciousness. Then I got to know him after Marvel, I went to work for a guy named Byron Price, who was starting a digital comics venture that I was running for him called Virtual Comics. And one of the things, Byron, who was my age, was friends with Will. and he was doing what was called the Spirit Screensaver. If you can remember back to screensavers, it was images, like 12 or 20 images from various Spirit comics in black and white, and then like a 15-second soundbite of Will being interviewed saying something about the thing, because that's all the people's computers could handle, was like a 15-second soundbite. So when I finally really met him working with Byron. Everything is context, right? If you bring Will Eisner, well, when he was alive, if you bring Will Eisner to a comic convention and he's got like big arrows pointing to him saying Will Eisner, then he's mobbed. But if he's just sitting at like a small publisher's table, so I remember standing on a chair yelling, "Meet Will Eisner!" Come meet Will Eisner, which is ridiculous. Will was like the biggest star there, but it was just without the context. It's like people would see Stan Lee. Did I mention I wrote a book about Stan Lee? People would see Stan Lee in in the convention, and you have like 20 bodyguards and you couldn't get near him. But he would be eating breakfast in the hotel restaurant the next morning with maybe one other person with him or something. So I got to meet Will and work with him a little bit with Byron, and I became very interested in comics history and the fact that that I am from New York City, but my ancestors, my grandparents were from Eastern European Ashkenazic Jews from Poland and Russia, and a lot of the guys who invented the comics and the superheroes were too. So I became fascinated by that, and that was part of my interest in the history of the business. Sort of interesting how this parallel world of comics that I loved and was so influential were coming into existence in the same neighborhoods that my parents and aunts and uncles were growing up in. So that's my interest in Will. So I learned a lot about Will. I researched a lot about him and then I wrote Superman on the Couch in 2004. And Will was kind enough to give me a blurb for it, even though, as we know, he was not a fan of superheroes.
Yeah.
So
he only put a mask on the Spirit because he had to.
Yeah, and he had some bad experiences with superheroes. But I think he felt the genre was a dead end as far as he was concerned. So he gave me a blurb, and then I did an interview with him I had a magazine that I packaged for Tomorrow's Publishing called Right Now Magazine with a W, and it was about comics writing. So I did about a year and a half before he died, I did a lengthy interview with Will, which was like probably the most nervous I've ever been for an interview. Not that he was so intimidating. He was actually very open and charming, but as as an interviewer, you must think. I know I do, and I'm sure you do. Especially when you're interviewing somebody who's been interviewed 1,000 times, you go, "Can I come up with even one question this guy has never heard before?" So I worked hard, and again, for all I know, Will said it to everybody. He said, "Your questions are very good," which, and it's an interview that's been reprinted a lot. But anyway, it was an interview, and then I sent him the raw copy, and he gave me notes on it. So that was part of my getting to know the man behind the work as well as the work which I'd read quite obsessively, and then all the different publications he did with Dennis Kitchen, and then so I had a Will Eisner. The talk I'm going to give, I've done various versions at Columbia University, at a lot of different places, and this was one where Jules Feiffer showed up, which was interesting. I knew I had invited him, but I didn't know if he was going to come or not. It was, is when he was living in New York City still, and this is at Columbia University. And I was giving my my life and times of Will Eisner. And I get a call as I'm in the cab on the way to Columbia. Danny, it's Jules. I'm going to be coming to your talk tonight. And of course, I suddenly became 10 times more nervous than than I had been. And so so there I am standing giving my talk, and my friends are there, my nephew was there. It was a nice crowd through Karen Green and Jeremy Dauber, who, Karen still is the comics librarian. Jeremy was very involved with the comics at Columbia then. And I'm feeling like, well, this is surreal. I'm giving a talk about Will Eisner and Jules Feiffer is in the audience. This is pretty strange. And at one point he said, one story I'll show you later. He said, I wrote that story when I was 17. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to sit down. And why don't you come up? Because I feel like a moron standing here talking about this story that you wrote. So he did. It was, and then, so through doing events like that, and I'm probably getting the chronology mixed up because I know it's a longer answer than you wanted, but Carl and Nancy Gropper, who run the Will Eisner Studios and the Will and Ann Eisner Foundation, they're the gatekeepers for everything Will Eisner. I think Carl is Will and Ann's nephew. So I had done, for the very first or maybe the second iteration of what's called Will Eisner Week, which I'll talk about in a little while, I had put together a panel at Jim Hanley's comic book shop on 33rd Street in Manhattan. Must be 10 or 12 years ago. And I put together Chris Couch, who's a comic scholar and professor, Denny O'Neill. I know I'm forgetting one or two other people, but I got Will's best friend from high school, who nobody knew existed except a friend of mine who'd worked with this guy, a guy named Ken Ginniger. I know I'm forgetting somebody. There were one or two other people on. So I put together this panel, and when I was through with it, Carl and Nancy Gropper invited me to be the chair of Will Eisner Week, which is a fancy way of saying I'm the guy who gets on the phone and on the email and whatever other means of communication and annoys people all over the world to get them to do events to celebrate Will Eisner and graphic novels and Will's legacy. And it's always around, because at one point I had made some wisecrack, like, because I would say to people, I'm doing something for Will Eisner Week. And they go, what's that? And I go, so, and again, I'm getting my chronology mixed up, but I think, so maybe I knew Carl and Nancy before that, but I would say to them something like, Will Eisner Week, the best kept secret in the world, ha ha, aren't I funny? And then go, oh yeah, you can do better? All right, you're now the chair of Will Eisner Week, and we're gonna pay you to do it too, so shut up. Don't shut up, that's. So for the past 10 or so years, people know to dread phone calls or emails from me because, aside from being a freelancer looking for work or sometimes an editor looking for them to do some work they don't want to do, I'm trying to convince them to do something, to commemorate Will and his work and graphic novels and free speech and just the whole wonderful world of sequential art, which all kidding aside, people are glad to do because everybody loved Will. And want to do something. So just to pat myself on the back, which I'm prone to do, me with Carl and Nancy and with the people on our different organizing and advisory boards, got it from like 2 or 3 annual events. We now have over 100 annual events. And of course, in the world in which we live, live events are not that popular or healthy these days. Because what we do is we find people who are professors at colleges or own comic shops or taught at schools or whatever. And they, wait, we got a room and we got these students or we have these customers. There's always a way to do something and we leave the rules about it, it doesn't have to be specifically about Will. It can just be about things inspired by Will or about comics and graphic novels in general. So we're in the midst of figuring out how to do it virtually, and we're working out a system where we will probably provide some material for people to use and access if they want online, combined with local things they might want to do either in person if they feel safe enough, or just local things from whatever their venue is. Wow, it's a really much longer answer than you wanted to. How did I get involved with Will Eisner? So it starts with Jules Feiffer. And if anybody's interested, if I forget to mention this later, which I don't think I will, but if as the months go on, check in at willeisner.com. And if you want to do some kind of event, either live or online, or get somehow hooked in to Will Eisner Week, please let us know, because we would love to keep it going despite the pandemic.
I remember that book because it was in my college library, first edition.
Uh-huh.
Libraries are helpful, people. Here's the thing about Will Eisner. Yeah.
Who the editor of that book was?
I don't remember.
E.L. Doctorow.
Really?
Yeah, he was working at the publishing company.
I don't remember that. I must
been
been obsessed with the characters that I discovered. So.
Oh yeah, no, that's a real piece of truth. I mean, the editors in those days generally didn't have that. How would you know who, unless you were in the book industry, how would you know who edited something?
Oh.
But in later years, that was,
like those things are fascinating because you kind of see it as a time capsule of who was and who wasn't big back then.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, of the heroes, you mean, or of the
heroes, the creators? Yeah.
Well, Doctorow hadn't become E.L. Doctorow yet,
Mm-hmm.
with capital E.L. He was a respected editor in the book business, but he hadn't broken out as a novelist yet.
I got to do my research on that. But I was looking at I was thinking of like Jack Cole and Plastic Man, and the thing about Eisner for me is that whenever the fan discussion starts up about who the greatest comics artist is of all time, there's a pretty significant portion that will automatically, without any question, they'll just say Jack Kirby.
Right.
And my counter to that argument is that it may be Jack, but I don't think it's a clear-cut argument. And my main argument is that Will Eisner exists.
And as you know, there's a lot of people who that Kirby leaves cold. Not me, but I mean, there are people. I mean, I think Mike Kaluta, who talk about incredible artists, he actually wrote an article. I didn't get a chance to read it, but he wrote an article about how I learned to appreciate Jack Kirby, which to me is a weird thing. I think maybe Ditko is more of an acquired taste. I could see people, but Kirby just, but that's what makes horse racing, I guess. But so I think there are people. I mean, I think you may be rare in your generation, right? I mean, I think people your age probably tend to would maybe more say Sienkiewicz or Kaluta or who would they say?
Well, I mean, among the people who have, studied the history of comics and everything, a lot of them still say Kirby.
Well, that's good.
But like, I was having this one conversation with somebody, and they asked me who the best was, just the plain best in terms of skill and like versatility of skill. And I said, well, if that's the case, I think I might have to say Sienkiewicz.
Huh, that's interesting. Well, you said that. I thought you were going to say Eisner, because I mean, I think Eisner is considered the best all around. Kirby, though, I mean, if you look at early Kirby or Kirby in the 50s, before he sort of simplified his work to kind of, streamlined it, he was pretty amazing. Everybody makes fun of Kirby's anatomy. The guy knew anatomy. He knew all that stuff, and he could do it and had done it.
Yeah.
There's an incredible story from a series that he and Joe Simon did called The World of Your Dreams. Did you ever see that?
I haven't seen The World of Your Dreams, but I know what you're
It's
talking about.
it was a series in the 50s or maybe late 40s, maybe, might have lasted 3 issues. I think it was for their own, when they had their own publishing company. And there's a story, because it's a dream, where Kirby is drawing everybody like they're in a Picasso painting. And it was like, holy cow, Jack does Picasso. It's just, it's what Kirby had in common with Eisner is is this belief in the potential of comics as an art form, not just as a craft and not just as a kind of low-level storytelling form. A real belief in comics, the potential to be art with a capital A, and also that they both went through multiple phases of reinventing themselves and reinventing the medium.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people, I think we must have talked about this last time, you get to be good enough at something, say comics, and good enough to get regular work, good enough that the editors keep hiring you, good enough that readers keep buying your stuff. And a lot of artists sort of have one period of innovation, if that, and then they kind of coast on that, on some version of that for their career, and they're fine with that. They're not, their ambitions are not beyond that. Or if they have ambitions beyond that, they're in another medium. But both Eisner and Kirby, till the end, kept putting out work that was experimental and innovative and cutting edge. I mean, they were of a certain generation, so their work did have a certain identifiable look. But so again, we'll go through Eisner's work in particular. It's rare for someone to have one great period, much less several. So that's Eisner, very interesting. And they did name the Eisner Awards after him for a reason.
Of course. Well, my thing was that, like, in terms of their overall influence on comics, I mean, I get that Jack's magnitude especially among superhero artists, was gigantic and unparalleled. But I just feel like Will's influence across the entire comics medium is wider, because I feel like I see it in more.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But I was trying to point out the things that they did have in common. I think Eisner, they were, I mean, one reason Eisner could and did reinvent himself in the way he did was he had made himself, after growing up in poverty in Brooklyn and the Bronx, he had gotten himself to a point where he didn't have to worry about money. He had, all those commercial endeavors he had been involved in after the Spirit served him well. And so he had the luxury of taking time and being able to focus attention. Because when I know it seems weird now to say that when Contract with God came out in 1978, it did not sell, very many copies. People, I bought it. Everybody I knew bought it, but I mean, it wasn't, it wasn't the thing. They didn't even print that many. I think Will actually subsidized the publisher just to have it out. So obviously over time, it's made up for that, and it's a standard text. But Will was lucky and skilled enough to be able to have a financial cushion where it'd say, let's try this weird thing that people don't even know where to put it in the bookstore. Even if somebody wants to buy it and somebody wants to sell it to them, where the hell do they put it? Is it a book? Is it a comic? There was no. I mean, that's one of my. I'll skip ahead. Well, later on, remind me to tell you the story about Will in Barnes and Noble, seeing the graphic novel section, because it's a better story in context.
Okay.
So perhaps this will be a good time for me to switch to.
You prepared a slideshow, so.
Okay.